1. Hello, everybody. I'm here today with Max Leyf again. Hi, Max. Thanks for coming and chatting.
All the way from Alaska, other side of the world, from one perspective.
It's quite weird, isn't it? Because you're like 8 hours behind me. It's just great that we can be able
Yeah.
to talk like this with Zoom. I'm quite anti-technology most of the time, but it's a great way to be able to chat. So it's early morning
amazing.
for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a sort of it's morning for me. I think it's evening for you. There's a sort of paradox though, which is I think the whole Corona situation it's really taken what we expect with things and sort of turn them inside out or turn them on their heads. And one thing that occurs to me is just it's basically in some ways it's hard to say this, but mask mandates and just the social distancing protocols, they you can't help but see the way in which they're dividing people and making people increasingly atomistic. And so whatever social connections and community people sense before, that's being strained. And I think everyone has the feeling. But then on the other side, I mean, it's amazing. You have to say exactly the opposite is happening at the same time. Like here are you and me connecting, across the world in a way that we probably wouldn't have other than Corona. And so it's always, I think there's, if you only see one side, you risk missing the full picture. So.
Yeah, I myself, I get Zoom fatigue after a while and can only watch so many things on Zoom or YouTube or whatever. I miss the interaction, the physical interaction with people. I miss going to conferences or meetings or groups and societies, and just there's an energy there when you're with someone, isn't it? Like hopefully we can still make that energy of coming across in a Zoom, but you know what I mean? Like when you're in a group.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no substitute for it. I'm teaching a course at the university, and we have our meetings virtually. In other words, we never see each other face to face, really. Although that's again a word that's meeting somebody, seeing somebody. Just over the course of the last 9 months, it's completely inverted what its meaning. And now we when we say face to face, we generally mean, we don't mean in person because we wear masks, so we don't see each other face to face when we're in person. In other words, you have to mean almost the opposite of that, what that used to mean, which is through digital media. And so right now we're seeing each other face to face, whatever that means. I mean, we know what it means, but it means the opposite of what it used to. Anyway, it's really challenging. Yeah, no, you just feel how much harder it is to establish that sense of community and solidarity. I'm thinking of my class, which, I mean, you mentioned Zoom fatigue, and I think I know exactly what you're talking about, because it's so taxing to try to maintain the sense of like we're here together. When you're not. I mean, you're just, everyone's looking at their own computer, and people are in their own houses and doing all kinds of 1,000 other things at the same time. But I guess that's what can we do? That's the world we're given today, and I suppose we can just try to make the best of it.
Yeah, it's weird though watching people talking on Zooms. Like if you're in a big meeting and you see everybody else in the little strip down the side, I had to learn to turn that off because I found I was watching all the people and suddenly realizing I'm being a bit of a voyeur, watching what people are up to and what their houses are like and things.
Funny thing is, people like take you on a tour through their house with they'll walk and go and do something, and they have their mobile phone or whatever, and like trying to see like, whoa, what's behind that door? But not really. I'm the same as you. I just think like, it's not my business, and I wish they wouldn't be so flagrant about it. But
yeah, well, when all this started, everyone was doing backdrops of sitting behind their library, and I was realizing I wasn't listening to people. I was watching looking at all the books. What books have they got? Not that I should judge people by what kinds of books they have, but maybe I do.
Yeah, you're judging, not only that, you're judging the books by their covers, and you're judging the people by the books. So.
But you were saying about masks. I was telling you just now that, yeah, I'm now exempt from wearing a mask because I was getting severe headaches from them. So, in this country, we have to go through our government website and make ourselves exempt. But I haven't had any problems not wearing a mask out and about. The only time I have is when I got off a train at Charing Cross, and it was rush hour. I was going to a Steiner reading group, actually. And I got off the train in rush hour, and all the people are there coming home from work, waiting for their trains, all in their masks, all just stared at me, like every single one. So I was walking along trying to, project love, likeness, and, be nice, dispel the negativity. But it's strange how you can see the anger, the perhaps the fear, I don't know if there was fear, but definitely anger, that, or questioning, why has she not got a mask on? Who does she think she is not to wear a mask?
The black sheep, that's you. You know, Debbie, that's a perfect example. Just think, not so long ago, if some crazy person were wearing a mask in the middle of the subway, that person would be getting all the stares. And look at how, again, the whole thing is turned on its head. And now you're kind of like the anomaly there, merely from the fact that everyone can actually see your face. You're not veiling your face, and that makes you the anomaly in that situation. It's really strange.
It's true though, isn't it? Because before, if you saw someone in a mask, you'd be like, and with their hood up, you'd be like, oh no, they're going to mug me. Or,
Right.
you know, like our local post office said to us, I don't care if you wear a mask, just don't come in with a shotgun. You know, and it's like, oh, it must be quite concerning for people like that.
Just think of what the word faceless means. You know, we think of like faceless bureaucracies or faceless. It means soulless, really. You know, and in some way, your face, it's kind of like the instrument that your soul is playing on. To you know, the face is so expressive. You think of like, you know, like your limbs. I mean, in some ways they're expressive too, but it's much more a question of if you think of movement, there you could you know, broadly sort of establish two categories of movement. This is oversimplifying, but I think it's worth it just because it could show some connection. Because if you think of like two kinds of movement, one is sort of efficient movement for the sake of productivity, call it like instrumental movement, or movement for the sake of some end, some utility, and so lifting up bricks or whatever, buckets. And that's one thing. You do it for the sake of something else. You don't do it for its own sake. You know, its end is always beyond itself. So you don't just lift up buckets you don't flex your muscles for their own sake. You flex your muscles because you need to lift up the bucket and carry it somewhere. The face is so much the opposite way. The only thing we do with our face that's instrumental like that is like chewing, you know. But everything else, I mean, you're always it's always a question of not instrumental movement, but expressive movement. You're expressing something. You're expressing your soul, you know, and the modulations and emotions of your soul through your face. And I mean, just, it's amazing. Like, then you cover that up. And what are we supposed to do?
It feels dehumanizing, I think. I think it's
Really
like
is.
as if they're trying to make us not interact with each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, we have a sort of broad theme of talking about Rudolph Steiner, and you know, I think we both have a sense if there's any, I mean, it would be important if Steiner can shed any insight on what we're going through right now. And as many people have observed, you know, 100 years ago, he, in some kind of you know, offhand remark at one of his lectures, he basically, he prophesied that within the next century, so that, you know, 21st century, that a vaccine would be developed that basically prevents people from you know, thinking in a spiritual or a living energetic way. And I mean, who knows what you're supposed to do with a statement like that from Rudolf Steiner when it's when it's so prophetic in some way. But you, I mean, you can't help but draw connections with what we're living through right now, and a statement like that from Rudolf Steiner. And so, I mean, it's a real question of how do we treat something like that? How do we relate to it? And it's a broader question too, which is, you know, all of Rudolf Steiner's all the information that he gave us. You know, what's the healthiest way to relate to it? I think it's not limited to Rudolf Steiner. It's, you know, all teachers, everyone that we look up to. It's always a question of being able to maintain a healthy relationship to it.
I've actually put that lecture on my YouTube channel. I can't remember the full title of the lecture, but it is on there. I read it out during this year, during the lockdown, because it really obviously reverberated for me reading that. I'd been told about it before and hadn't really thought much of it. And then all this happened and I instantly remembered that lecture of his, because he's saying that, I can't remember now if it's Lucifer or Aaron Man is the one that's instigating this kind of thing. Both of their jobs is to get rid of it.
We should say what we mean by those words.
So Lucifer and Aaron Man are the two, like the dark side of spirituality. I suppose they're God's enemies, if we wanted to call it God. I don't think Steiner ever actually uses the word as God, does he, or enemy?
Not
But
very often, no.
he's saying that their roles are to take us away from God. Their mission is to distract us from God, so we don't continue our mission to get to God.
And they do that in kind of opposite and complementary ways, those two figures. And I wonder if you would want to say anything more about, I guess again, they're kind of polar opposites. And we talked about this in our last meeting about how in some way they're kind of like mythological depictions of Aristotle's notion of the golden mean. And so if you picture the straight path or God or Christ in the center, then you have the Joker on one side and the thief on the other side. And there must be some way out of here, said the Joker to the thief. And the way out of there is always the middle way, but it's a question of being able to I'm of course quoting Bob Dylan, and I hope everyone gets the reference. Our Nobel laureate from 4 years ago, 2016. The way out of there is always the middle way, which is to say, neither the left-hand path or the right-hand path in some ways, but Lucifer and Ahriman are kind of again they're beings that will try to magnetize us towards one side or the other. And I think it's worth trying to say, it's worth trying to conceptualize the situation we're going through right now in terms of in the Lucifer terms of Lucifer and Ahriman. Just for the sake of, if you think what those knowing about those beings can do for us, it's the same as learning any concept. And what I mean is that it will allow you to organize your perception, and in fact, it's a condition for perceiving certain things. To have a concept for certain things is a condition for perceiving them. Like if we don't have don't have a facility with the concepts of Lucifer and Ahriman, we won't recognize the relation amongst different phenomena. We'll just see data. We won't see evidence. We won't see meaningful relations. And so I always think it's worth trying to say, how do we perceive those beings? Not only like how do we memorize what Herr Doktor hat gesagt, how do we memorize what Rudolph Steiner told us, but really how do we also treat it not as again just facts that we assimilate, but rather something that we take into ourselves and we understand, really. So the difference between knowledge as informational content and knowledge as understanding, I think, is always something Steiner is explicitly over and over again. He's emphasizing it, but I think all too often it's kind of in some ways the content is so much more flashy. You have all these spiritual beings, and it's so much more. It sort of attracts your attention. It glitters in a way that the hard work of really trying to, again, like, I don't know, address the fundamentals and really establish the method of cognition that can allow you to really make sense of them. That's much less sexy. It's kind of, but as you can probably tell, I obviously think it's really important. So
it is important though, because I suppose in this materialistic world, secular world, people aren't thinking about this kind of thing and would now poo-poo these kind of ideas because it's silly old religion and we're living in a rationalistic world. But that's the cleverness of Lucifer and Aaron. They hide behind all this and we can't see them, and they're deceitful. And I think the tale is what's the greatest trick the devil ever pulled, and it's for us not to be able to believe he exists. And Lucifer comes in through our head, doesn't he? Lucifer's on our mind. I sometimes get Aaron a bit confused, because I know in the books Steiner talks about Aaron coming up from below, but Lucifer's playing with our mind, and what we don't want is the two of them to join in our middle near our solar plexus. So they're like energies.
What we should say is they're not in a way. So our physical bodies are essentially spatial. That's what we mean by physical body. We should say, when we're talking about other bodies, like once we're not talking about physical bodies anymore, but if we're talking about etheric bodies or astral bodies, Lucifer and Ahriman, beings like that, they're not essentially spatial at all. And so when we say one of them is coming from above, one of them is coming from below, it's much more the Hermetic maxim, as above, so below. That doesn't mean like, I don't know, whatever is it. It's not a spatial, it's not using those words spatially. It's not a spatial designation to say as above, so below. It's, whatever quality, it's qualitative, not quantitative, is another way to think of it. So whatever quality the stars have to our perception, like phenomenologically, if you look up at the night sky, you get a certain experience. Or at any sky, if you look above you into the heavens, you get a certain experience. If you touch the earth and feel your body, you get a different kind of experience, a qualitatively different experience. That's how we should try to we should always try to relate images and spatial terms to those fundamental experiences in our souls, not necessarily in our concept of the physical world.
But maybe that's why people have trouble with it, because not many people want to connect to their souls, do they? Or don't think about that kind of thing.
I think people have trouble from it because of Ahriman. And here's what I mean by that. You said they're deceptive, and that's exactly the Harmonic deception. It's to treat the physical world as though it's the totality. In other words, you imagine something like, and it comes, and here, I mean, I've mentioned before that my interest in Rudolph Steiner, it will tend to, in some ways, what I find the most compelling, and always my interest will sort of just tend towards Rudolph Steiner's most, his basic and earliest work, which is work in the theory of knowledge and work in perception and cognition, his philosophical work with Goethe. This to me, it's a way of, it's a kind of critical thinking and self-reflection on our own process of making sense of the world. And to me, this is it's like the most sure-seas way of kind of seeing through the Harmonic deception. And you just realize that there's no way to think, it's totally, it's really nonsense. Our naive view of the world, as though we could explain everything by physics and by naturalistic explanations. It's really, really, really nonsense in a fundamental way. But you have to do a lot of thinking before it becomes clear to you in some way. And I think for obvious reasons, people will tend to shy away from that.
Yeah, we're lazy creatures, humans. They don't want to think. They like to be told. And I've discovered that myself from going from different societies and things, of the people that want the answer like that and trying to explain to them, we need to ponder on this. You read the, whether you're Steiner, Gurdjieff, Blavatsky, whatever, you ponder on it, you digest it, and the answers start unfolding inside you.
That's a great way to put it.
People feel they don't have the time to do that, or don't want to put in the time to do that. Rudolph
Steiner literally says the least important thing, and the word in German is allerwenigste. The least important thing that I'm communicating to you, he says this too in lectures, der allerwenigste, the least important thing is the anthroposophical content. So all of these names and all of the, the content that most people think of with anthroposophy, he doesn't say it's not important at all, but he says it's the least important thing. And that always kind of stops me in my tracks, and it's often kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like a wake up to me, and I often find myself sort of detaching from some pursuits and rededicating myself to others in respect to Rudolph Steiner's work.
But there'd be rededicating yourself to pursuits that you feel are fulfilling your own spiritual development.
And also just following Rudolph Steiner's advice. And it's kind of, one reason that I, keep coming back to Steiner is because those two things that you described, they really coincide. It's like every time I really engage with Rudolph Steiner, I had this feeling like, this is good for me. I don't know how else to describe it. It sounds funny, but yeah.
No, I totally agree with you. I feel the same way. Sometimes I used to have to really push myself to read his books. And like I was saying to you in our last little talk, suddenly one day I had the epiphany of things started coming together. But once I do read them, I know there's something in there. And You know, it's like my soul or my essence or whatever you want to call it is saying this is good for you. You know, it's that little voice in your head or in your heart or in your solar plexus is saying keep going, you know. And if it makes you feel good but you're still struggling with it, then you know you're still got things to learn, because it never stops, does it? This is a continuous process, and we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over again why we're here, what we're doing, why we want to do this.
Absolutely. And so, you know, Ahriman, just to try to bring it back to these, the concepts that we set before us and these beings. And again, so to think about like, why would it be important to ask a question like this? Why isn't it enough? Why isn't it enough just to know their names? You know, and it's for one reason, it's because it will help us to, you know, it enhances and increases it will help us to organize our perception. So we'll be able to see things that otherwise we couldn't. In the same way that you don't see anything for which you don't have a concept. It's not visible to you. You might see other things. And so that's one reason. And then we can also think of, you know, it's a kind of circularity in respect to concepts like this, because it's also like you know, the concept is both the end and the beginning of the perception. In other words, we're trying to understand Lucifer and Ahriman, and so we somehow, you know, once we have the concept, then suddenly, how do you say it? It both organizes our perception, but our perception is of it. So again, it's in some way that the end and the beginning. But you might think that's a problem because it's circular. You know, it's like bad logic. It's begging the question. And the reason I don't think that's important is because what are you supposed to do? You like step outside of meaning, right? That's what it is. And so it's circular in principle, because it's like the alpha and the omega. In the beginning was the logos, and in the end will be the logos too, and everywhere in between. So, but so, you know, Ahriman will basically draw us into towards the presumption that that there's no such thing as the spiritual world. And that's, I think, itself is a term that deserves a lot of unpacking. And it's basically like, if you, Rudolph Steiner a number of times defines it as the spiritual world as everything that's not immediately perceptible by the senses. And it's much less kind of like, I don't know what the word is, but exotic or mystical at the beginning than it might seem. You know, a little bit of thought will reveal that it's much more straightforward than that. And you realize that most of what we think of as like the world and value, and again, like the world we live in and our lives and ourselves and our friends and people we love, all of these, none of these things is immediately available to your senses. If you think about somebody, I mean, think about the blue moon last night, you know, the blue moon or the red Mars. It's an amazing sight, those two together. And the moon's not exactly blue, but you know, they call it a blue moon when it happens twice in a month. It's the Halloween moon, the Samhain moon. Yeah. Or if you think of somebody you love or your friend, right? Just when I look at you, you know, what I'm seeing with my eyes, it's pixels. And so it's really obvious that that by itself is not, that's not the whole story. But Ahriman will try to fool us into thinking that it is. And they'll try to fool us into thinking that basically you receive the whole world is, you know, kind of, it's like what you can lay your hands on. It's a kind of Bishop Berkeley is famous for his argumentum ad lapidem, or not Bishop Berkeley, but Samuel Johnson is famous for his argumentum ad lapidem against Bishop Berkeley. Who Bishop Berkeley saying that, oh look, everything is, you know, in some ways spiritual, ideal, and Samuel Johnson he says it's just not true. But he can't come up with any kind of argument against it, so he kicks a stone and says, "Here's how I refute it, you know, because I kicked the stone and my foot hurts." That's a kind of, it's a silly picture, but I think that's a good, it's a kind of vignette that can point us towards what Ahriman will try to make us think.
Steiner talks a lot about seeing things with our spiritual eyes. It's as though he's trying to tell us how to view things properly, which I think is what we should be doing, isn't it? Like what you've just described, that's the way to see through it, is to be able to see with our spiritual eyes, which is quite a weird thing to say and a difficult thing to understand sometimes, but it's a
William Blake has a great way of saying this. He says, like, he leads up to it, with this big poetic exhortation. Then he says, you know, I don't see with my eyes, I see through them. And as long as, I think, to me, as long as I can keep that straight, then it's really self-evident what's going on here. And again, when I look at the computer screen, I see, a million different pixels, but there's a certain constellation of those pixels that's meaningful to me, and that's you. And obviously that meaningfulness, and I think of seeing the moon or Mars for me, it was not that long ago this morning when the sky was dark. I could watch the full moon set out of the window. Oh. And it's obvious that it moves you in a certain way, but it's like that feeling of, because you think like this is sublime or something, or this is beautiful, and then it's really obvious, like the feeling that the quality of sublimity, sublimeness, or beauty, those are not, the world that Ahriman will entice us into is a world without those things, because those are not things you see with your eyes. They're things you see with your, with your soul, with your mind, with your I don't know what to call it, yourself.
It's difficult to explain, isn't it? Because I try and see all this when they say about, well, this is what Lucifer and Aaron Man wants to bring us to, their version of the world, which seems all to be an illusion anyway. But what is it they're going to get from us? I think it's just the satisfaction that we've broken away from God and landed in their world, whether it's the eighth sphere or whatever it is. But to be able to actually see what it is they want us to see is just all, what it is like an illusion, and like we were saying before, deceit, isn't it? And deception, and not the real thing. But it's very difficult. It's kind of like the Matrix movie, isn't it? They think they're all living in the Matrix, in the real world, when really it's the Matrix. We're being deceived all the time, and we need to remove that veil, like they say in mystical terms, lift the veil of Isis, and then you'll see what's really happening.
Exactly. And so, from the Ahriman perspective of Ahriman, he would try to get us to think like, okay, when you look at something and it moves you, that's because your neurotransmitters are being tickled, or your levels of, your hormonal levels are fluctuating or something. And so you see how immediately it's like, and love, if you feel love, it's like dopamine and oxytocin or something. And so it's like everything will immediately have a material explanation. And so all the things that you think are most meaningful, most significant, most profound about the world, they're immediately reduced to, again, kind of like material scientific terms.
Yeah.
And this is one way we'll be kind of deceived. And I think, you see this right now too, which is, people are concerned about, the influence of Ahriman that Ahriman is exerting on the global civilization right now, because you see this in the response to the corona situation, because nobody is thinking about, for example, nobody's thinking about the maybe nobody's thinking at all, or maybe like a few people are thinking, and they're doing a good job convincing the rest of us not to think about this. But just if you try to tap into the narrative that we get from, I guess, just media, corporate media, the idea is like, it's a straight, direct transmission of a material particle that infects you, and the only solution really is either through spatial distancing or through a vaccine. And so these are all ways of, again, kind of reducing the whole situation to what you can measure in a laboratory. It's a good way to think of it. And you realize like what's not being accounted for here. It's the same kind of thing as is not being accounted for if we look at the moon and think that it's because of your neurotransmitters that it's a beautiful scenery. The same kind of thing is being ignored here, which is like, what is the idea of like think about the kind of world that you're creating. You alluded to this in the subway station. It's like, why would we even want to go on living if we can't have any human connections? right? And in a world like that, and you know, but again, you can't measure meaningfulness or beauty or love or anything important. You can't measure those things in a laboratory, and so they're kind of de facto and from the very beginning going to be not accounted for in the picture that we're getting, you know, according to Ahriman, who seems to be kind of ascendant right now in the world. And so that
Yeah,
just
definitely, because it's definitely having an effect on people's mental states, because we are social animals and we like to interact. I know most people would probably go down the pub or to the bar to interact with people. They're not allowed to do it, so they're not seeing anyone. So that's breaking down their mental esteem and probably their uh, own livelihood of what their life's about. Also, we're not allowed to go to churches. Some churches have opened up in the UK now, but for a long time the churches were shut. I've recently done a little film. I couldn't get any holy water anywhere, so they weren't allowing holy water to be dispersed. And you think, like, well, why is all this happening? Why it's like a clampdown and all the spiritual, no singing in church, not allowed
I
to
mean, it's
sing to
amazing.
God.
And just think about what that means. Like when people define health and illness, you know, from the perspective of Ahriman, um, you get like health is an absence of acute infection by a pathogen, and it's something that you basically I mean, the way you ensure health is through pharmaceuticals, basically. You know, it's a completely materialistic explanation of health, and it's so far from reality. And you realize, like, if we weren't having the wool pulled over our eyes by Ahriman, it would be self-evident to everyone that how important it is to be healthy. It's not just a question of keeping your social distance from people. In fact, in some ways, it's the opposite of that. It's a question of nourishing your body, certainly, but also your mind and also your spirit. And you realize, like, we're going to become, if we're not already sick, we're going to become sick by all the measures that are being, you know, put in place in order to ostensibly avoid just that thing.
Yeah, exactly. And also because one of the things that I've been trying to remind people to do, you know, I can be a bit naughty and not eat my fruit every day, but we need to just eat healthily, take our vitamins, keep ourselves, our bodies healthy. And this is one of
And
the
to have a
things.
sense of gratitude and you know, a sense of the miracle that it is that we get this sustenance from the earth. And you know, it's just an amazing process how, you know, it's incredible. It's kind of like the sunlight sacrificing itself to be bound, like, you know, crucified into material form for the sake of nourishing us, you know.
Because that was another thing I found weird, that they were telling us all to stay in. It was obviously summertime at my side of the world. And vitamin D is one of the most important things we need to go against flus and colds. So we needed to go out and get the sunshine.
But see, I don't mean to pick on you, but you're turning it into again, like an harmonic view of the situation, and thinking of it's like a synthetic, or it's like not a synthetic exactly, but it's a vitamin that you need. But it's also the experience of the sunlight. I mean, people get depraved if they don't experience the sunlight, and it's not merely a question of that their vitamin levels go out of sync. And because that way of thinking, you'll always say, like, well, I can just supplement. And
Yeah.
but again, that's the harmonic picture. There's something. I mean, people um, people belong together with the sunlight. Yeah. And if you separate that, you're never going to be able to compensate for it in
Yeah.
some way.
Well, because in the Steiner work, the sun is a very important thing anyway, of the with the energies. I don't properly understand all the planets and the moon's influences on us, but the sun is a very important part of us when we're developing ourselves anyway, whether physically or spiritually. Feeling the solar energies coming from the sun. And I know the moon's more of a, you know, dreamy, illusionary, if we look at it from the mystical point of view. But it can also be seen as a portal. Like, I mean, I know many people are saying this blue moon is a portal. It could be the way to escape all this, if we can all pray or wish towards it, you know, a way out of this current situation. Because I know we were discussing Aaron Man, but Lucifer coming from the mind, we need to stop our minds being played on by him or her or whatever Lucifer is, and instead do this kind of like turning around the fear and the concern about everything and putting out positive thoughts.
Yeah, that's probably a good place. Like I hope that anyone who's interested and who's been following the discussion has a kind of a sense for Ahriman. And the idea that I have is like, if you get to know somebody, you won't be deceived if you encounter them and they're wearing different clothes, or even maybe they're wearing a mask. But you get to know somebody and you recognize them and all of their different habits, if you see what I mean. And I think that's kind of our mandate with Lucifer and Ahriman, for instance. It's like try to get to know them in the sense of like becoming familiar with them, so that you're able to recognize them in all the forms that they take, in all the expressions they do, all the effects that they have. You're able to say like you're able to. I mean, they almost have a smell or something, or it's like, oh, I recognize they have like a flavor or something. And I hope that by now we've at least introduced something of that sort of familiarity in respect to Ahriman. And so it's probably a good time to talk about Lucifer a little bit. And in some ways, we'll try to describe almost the polar opposite to what Ahriman is doing, which is it's like a perverted extroversion, like drawing people out. So, leaving the soul behind and turning everything into, material and um, physical structures. And Lucifer would kind of be the opposite. It's like the tempter of mystical types, which is like, again, sort of, if we think of Ahriman as a perversion of like the extroverted tendency, you could think of Lucifer as a perversion of the introverted tendency. It's like it's like you already have all of the answers in you. You don't need anyone else. I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but it's like sometimes, like some traditions of Buddhism have the idea that the highest attainment is to sort of leave everything behind. And many of the for example, that's in some ways that's the ideal of one of the early forms of Buddhism, the Theravada Buddhism, teaching of the elders, I think it translates. And there was a real revolution within Buddhism several hundred years later, roughly 300 or 400 AD, I think. And that was called the Mahayana Revolution. It's called like the greater vehicle. And the idea is like, in fact, it sort of turned the thing around. And I think to many people's perception, especially today, it's a kind of correction for the Luciferic tendency. The Luciferic tendency it would draw us into this kind of escapism almost. Escaping the world, basically, leaving the world behind. Like that's the highest attainment is to achieve nirvana and just get out of this place.
So it's kind of deceiving you through theological thought in a way, because I used to wonder that when I was studying Buddhism, of the whole point of, well, if we're getting away, then what's the point of living in this world?
Yeah. And the Mahayana is a corrective for that, because it says the highest ideal is to be the bodhisattva. And so you maybe you have the ability to just check out, but you renounce it for the sake of sentient beings. Yeah, and you're standing at the gates of nirvana, so to speak. This is a metaphor. Nirvana doesn't have literal gates in the way we might imagine, but just like as long as we can relate to these images, not as idols, but as images, then we have a healthy relationship to them, and we can see them as they mean something, and that's the point. It's so tempting. This is with Steiner. I always think of this, but people mistake. It's like you want to throw away the kernel, or people end up throwing away the kernel and keeping the shell. They keep the husk. Yeah, and there's a mistake of like what is kernel and what is husk in the case of Rudolph Steiner's work. And we touched on that with the idea that in fact the real kernel is not what you think it is. The real kernel is the sort of like the way it changes you, the way it develops you, the way it educates you through practicing. It's not the anthroposophical content. And again, Rudolf Steiner says the anthroposophical content is like the husk here, and people are making the mistake. And I think it's the same with, if we think of like the gates of nirvana. Obviously, there's not actual gates there, but the gate can mean something to us if we're able to relate to it in the right way. And the bodhisattva, in some ways, like stops at the gates and says, I renounce the gates of nirvana. All the gods are saying, no, come on in, you earned this, and these are the Luciferic temptations. They're saying you deserve this. Yeah. And the bodhisattva says, okay, but on the condition that everyone else, every other sentient being enters first. And then you get a sense for this life has real value.
Yeah, it's like that compassionate move onwards.
And so I think this was actually really good to talk about. Buddhism was a really easy entry point into what can happen with the Luciferic, sort of like Luciferic influence when it goes too far. In the same way that sort of talking about modern science is a good way to think about when harmonic, modern scientific culture is when the harmonic temptation goes too far.
But like we were saying at the beginning, Steiner kind of saw all this was going to happen. He might not have been able to prophesize it completely, but he saw that this was a possible way. And he seems to, I sometimes felt like there was a bit of a warning coming that this could be humanity's last chance. Do you get that from his work, or is there a chance that we will get through this and continue?
I don't know. There's always, it's really hard, and this comes to kind of the mystery of, I guess, free will. But it's like, it always seems like this could be the end. Right? And there's a kind of, people. Yeah, it's kind of it's really mystery. People, but we know that for example, like Saint Paul, 2,000 years ago, had the idea that any day could be the rapture. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I don't think this is entirely separate from the prescription that you find in like medieval Catholic tradition, and also in the Hindu tradition, and also the Buddhist tradition. In Latin, the phrase is memento mori. Mm-hmm. It's like, remember that any day could be your last. And in some way, I think it's like it's necessary for us to always have. It's necessary for us to come to terms with the I guess, with our mortality, and also because it gives things, it makes things high, it gives things stakes. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you become Luciferic, and you think like, I can just.
Well, I think that's what's happening, isn't it? Especially in this last 100 years, people. It sounds terrible me saying this, but with people coming away from religion, so they're not being reminded of this kind of thing. So they do think they're going to live forever. People, just don't believe they're going to die.
That's what you just described. It's like a pristine image of of how Lucifer and Aaron always work together. Because most people, the most salient form that dream that you described, the most salient form that it takes today is the kind of, technocracy and transhumanism. The idea that, science is going to solve this ultimate problem of death for us. And again, that's a way to become Luciferic in the sense of you think you're somehow beyond the human condition. And it's also, but it shows how Ahriman is the one that supports that, through the technologicization of everything. And so they're always, in some ways, despite that they're opposites in a way, they always end up collaborating to our detriment. Yeah, that's a perfect example.
I watch a lot of programs on on YouTube and BitChute and things, lots of interviews with people that are into transhumanism, and they have no spiritual belief at all. Most of them even admit happily, well, we're atheists, so why should I not have the right to live forever, and continue? It's quite it was quite alarming, or quite amazing, that I saw so many people were so like that. And I don't know if it's their right, isn't it, to think that way. If they want to be an atheist, it's up to them. If they don't want to believe in a God, but then it's not for people like us that have some kind of faith in something. It's like, well, where does the soul come into all this? If we live forever, the soul never fulfills its role, surely. And if we become human and become into cyborg bodies or whatever, we're not going to develop ourselves as the humans we're supposed to be. I just can't imagine that whatever the God, I like to call it the divine source, is it's given us free will to go ahead and do what we want. So maybe it doesn't mind that we become robots and cyborgs in the future, but I don't know, it just doesn't seem right to me.
Well, it'd be like if the leaves never fell off in autumn, and then they would suffocate the new ones that tried to come back in the spring.
Yeah.
On the tree of life.
And I always wondered, like, I suppose because we're coming from a religious point of view, that we think one day we will perhaps return to the divine source, and it's our soul that needs to do that. Or what if this is just a learning curve on this planet, and we're supposed to go on to somewhere else after our death? Because most people like ourselves don't believe that once we die, that's the end of it. But I believe, obviously, atheists just think when they die, that's it, they're out, they're gone, they're never to be heard or seen of again. There is no further on after death. So they're looking for that way of continually being alive forever, eternally.
It's a really strange situation, because nothing about that kind of worldview, if you think everything is just kind of, like atoms in a void, there's no reason at all to even think that it would be a good thing to live longer. It's a kind of concealed appeal to a spiritual desire, but it's concealed under the veil of technology of Armon, basically. Because why would it be any better to live longer than shorter? All things are, in that case, there's no hierarchy of values, really. You took everything, you took God and everything that would be the standard against which to measure things. You took that out of your picture. And so again, why is dying today any worse than dying, never dying? It's not. You've taken out the standard of value.
What if they were right and they did die and there was nothing, or we all died and there was nothing afterwards? Well, there's none of us to go ha at each other for anyway, if it was the complete nullity of my existence. But I suppose from our own studies and my own in-depth feeling, I just feel there is more to life, and I've seen proof to life after death, like the next stage. I've studied reincarnation and rebirth and things, and it seems to be quite plausible to me, or even that we could possibly even go on to another level. Doesn't necessarily mean we come back to this life. Maybe our essence, soul, or whatever goes on to something else. I know Steiner talks a lot about reincarnation, but it's part of the evolution of humanity, isn't it? And we're gonna, he normally says we come back every 1,000 years, where some beliefs are, I think theosophy says we come back as soon as we die, we're put into the next, we go into Detaching for a little while, and then we come back into another body.
They obviously discovered the Dalai Lama, and they discovered the Dalai Lama already as a young child. When the one passes away, they've already found a young child. That's the next one.
Well, funny you bring him up. I was actually talking to someone yesterday about how he says he's not coming back, and this is his last incarnation, or he might go west. He hasn't decided yet, apparently. And I find that quite interesting. He said that, and then there's all these prophecies that this is the last pope. And there's a few other prophecies in other religions that this is the sort of the last of the certain things. And it's like, or say like the Mayan calendar was saying it's the end of a cycle, we're starting a new one. So it does feel like we're going through a big change. And I know we've got the Pisces to Aquarius change as well. So maybe that's why people like Steiner and such were about in their years, to prepare us for the change. And hopefully we will go forward with humanity evolving rather than de-evolving, which I'm concerned about. But so many people seem to think, oh, God will come and save us, or Christ will come and save us. But what if there isn't that? What if we're here to do something? And I think that's what Steiner's saying, isn't it? We've got to work on ourselves.
Yes. And one thing that's really stayed with me is it's a prayer from Saint Teresa of Avila, and she says, something along the lines of Christ has no hands but these. And the idea is, people are waiting for somebody else to come and save them. But the idea is we're supposed to allow Christ to work through us. And there's a funny way of saying it. It's like the person who's stranded on a desert island, shipwrecked on an island. And somebody comes to rescue him, and he says, no, God will provide. And then somebody else comes, somebody comes in a canoe, and then somebody comes in an aircraft carrier, and then somebody comes in a helicopter, and whatever, one thing after another. And he says, no, don't worry about me. And then finally he starves to death on the desert island.
Yeah, because God had been sending all them other messengers to help him. He sent the birds and the planes and the canoes.
That's what am I supposed to do? I gave you all
all these people waiting for the God to suddenly appear and sort it out for them. But God gave us free will to do it for ourselves.
yeah, to make ourselves transparent to the light of Christ, so to speak. And and this is where it's really it's it's dangerous territory in some way, because you realize that you're really walking the razor's edge, because the other side is to say, well, then God doesn't exist if it's just people. That's the harmonics. You fall to the harmonic side of the razor's edge. You say, well, we just mean us. And again, this is it's also Luciferic, because then you end up, either, I mean, in some ways, by denying God, you are saying, you see how this goes. It's the same thing as saying, I am God. And that's the Luciferic expression of it. To say there's no God. There's no God is the harmonic expression. To say I am God is the Luciferic expression. Those two things, they have to come together, because, God is the only way we can, make sense of the fact of the world on the one hand, and the fact that we can even, the fact of sense making on the other hand, right? So, mind and world, and they come together. And so, it's, I think it's, I mean, I agree with you. It's just, it's so hard. It's almost as though language, it just lacks the precision to, or the balance to walk that razor's edge. Yeah. But to say what you said, which is like, people think that somebody's going to come, they think some divine being, some like an archangel or God is going to come and save us. And that's not the right way of thinking about it. That's not the same thing as denying God, but it can look that way, from a certain perspective.
But we can still pray to them for help and guidance.
Of course.
Yeah, because I think they give us hints, or give us signs, or whatever, in that kind of way of helping us.
And the amazing thing is, like, it's actually Christ that brings us to pray in the first place. And so it's like your prayer is answered in the very expression of it. And if any, I mean, it sounds crazy, but if you think about the kind of, metanoia, like kind of conversion or inner transformation that it takes to go from a situation of whatever situation you're in to a situation of prayer, it's a conversion right there. And you've already, by the time you open your lips to pray, you've already, again, it's like you've already received what you're looking for, which is that sort of communion with the, the spiritual essence of the world.
Because prayer is a very powerful thing, and today is Halloween. It's the 31st of October, and between today and November the 2nd is known as the All Hallowed Days and Evenings. And Steiner used to say that on these days we should light a candle and look upon it and think about our lost friends, lost family, and perhaps try to contact the spiritual realm. Maybe not contact it, maybe that's not what he meant, but he said that in the past, before we became the humans that we are now, we used to, because we had thinner bodies, we're too dense now to do it, but we used to be able to put on an ethereal skin, didn't we? Or ethereal skin, to be able to walk into the spirit realms. And so we understood it better, where now we don't seem to have that kind of ability to do. So I think that's why a lot of people have kind of don't have the understanding of what it is to stay in touch with God or the spirit realms, that there is more to life after this, because we don't have the ability to find it out for ourselves like we used to.
Yeah, I think you can tell because our dreams are generally so shadowy, at least to begin with. I think that's an expression of what you were describing, the change that people have undergone over centuries, millennia. And I would say about the candle, it's a perfect example of how well, it's kind of like superstition or idolatry, even, to think that lighting the candle itself is like performing some magical act. I think if you pay attention, though, as you're doing the ritual, you realize that again, you undergo a sort of conversion right there on the spot, and suddenly, whatever you thought was, however you were relating to the world the moment before then, you again have a kind of transformation inwardly, and you begin to orient yourself towards, for example, the people that have come before us, and that already it's again, it's somehow, it's a kind of paradox or a mystery, but it's it's like a prayer is accomplished. It's already a fait accompli. Like it's accomplished. It's not something you have to wait for. It's accomplished in the very act itself.
Yes, indeed. Amen to that.
Well, Debbie, it's really I just want to say what a pleasure it is. And I just want to thank you and express just how grateful I am for that you, I don't know, that you set up these conversations, and, you know, we've done a couple now, and I know you're doing them with other people. And I mean, it's just really a special thing to have somebody like you, you know, kind of just serving as, you know, to connect all of us. And so I just want to express that I'm thankful to you for that initiative you're putting
Oh,
forward.
well, I want to thank you as well for these. You make my ego go boo. But yeah, it's great to do. I like these kind of talks. For me, they're a good way of helping me figure out what I'm trying to pursue in my own spiritual paths. And,
Yeah.
you know, without hopefully it helps other people as well. If it does, that's fantastic. If it doesn't, or if people laugh, I don't care. It just, I think these things are needed. These kind of chats and talks are needed in these times.
Well, could I say one thing about the comment that you just made, where you said, you know, on one hand, you're talking about establishing the community, and and in the same breath, you're saying that it kind of it helps to you know, it helps you develop and discover yourself. And so you have the individual on one side and the community on the other side, but you realize that you know, if you think of one of them at the expense of the other, you're always falling into the, you know, the Joker or the thief, the left hand or the right hand, the Lucifer and Aaron. And you realize that in the center, and, you know, this is expressed from one of Jesus's sayings, where he says, "Wherever two or more are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst." You realize that always, like, the true self, like when it's true, when it's in the center, and when it's not with Lucifer or Aaron, those two things will always be developed in tandem and in concert, and they support each other. It's not a kind of dissolution into the community that you see that temptation everywhere, kind of like dissolution into a group identity. It's not that on the one hand, but it's also not a kind of like rugged individualism on the other hand, where I'm this kind of atomic individual that's separate from everything else. And somehow, you know, when we're able to balance the Luciferic impulse on the one side and the Harmonic impulse on the other side, then we end up, you know, again, right in the center. And I thought you gave a beautiful description of it. And so I just wanted to, you know, point it out and kind of express it in the terms that we've laid out during this talk.
Well, thank you very much, Max. It's always fantastic to chat to you. If people wanted to contact you, is there a website or something?
Yeah, and maybe you would be willing to put it in the like on a description to this video.
Yeah.
But I'll say I have a website. It's Theoria Press at wordpress.com, and so I'll send you the address.
Super, thank you. I'll put it down in the comments, like I try to remember to do most times. But thank you very much, Max, and we'll do this again soon, definitely.
Great, I look forward to that day, and until then, best wishes to you, and farewell, Debbie.
Okay, you take care. Thank you.